Despite the money spent, research conducted, diagnoses given, the scientific world is no closer to a cure for Alzheimer's than it was decades ago. Our guest tonight taps into this mystery in her book, The Alzheimer Conundrum, Entanglements of Dementia and Aging. Margaret Lock is here with us in studio. Welcome to the agenda this summer.
Thank you.
What is the conundrum of Alzheimer's disease?
It's difficult to explain, but I chose that title because it gets people, the hope is to get people to understand right away from the outset that we're not going to solve this problem anytime soon. This is an extraordinarily difficult challenge that we have on our hands these days. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the most interesting parts of the conundrum is that now that they have the technology of neuroimaging, it's possible to see into the brains of people before they die, which is a relatively recent technology. And it confirms what they suspected from long ago, which a good number of people, perhaps up to 30% of people, when they die of something else in old age, carry the symptoms that we think are the gold standard for diagnosing dementia, and particularly Alzheimer's. In other words, about 30% of the population has an Alzheimer brain, perhaps, if we're correct, but the mind is fine.
Okay, we're going to delve into that idea of the brain and the mind and Alzheimer's in a minute. When we talk about epidemics in society, I think what jumps to mind, HIV/AIDS, cancer.
Right.
Alzheimer's has been characterized as an epidemic. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
It's a fairly recent characterization, and I'm uncomfortable with it for two reasons. First of all, these days we do talk about epidemics that are not infectious. Obviously, epidemic was a word that was originally used in connection with infectious diseases. And we no longer do that. We talk about epidemics of this, that, and the other, all sorts of things. But the reason very often that conditions or diseases are given the term epidemic is to assist with raising money in order to do research and develop drugs in connection with that problem. And I can understand why the people who work in this arena feel the need to do this, because much, much less money has been given to Alzheimer research than to that of heart disease or cancer.
I think also arguably that colloquially people call it an epidemic because it seems to be everywhere. Almost everyone now knows someone who is afflicted by Alzheimer's. And as you said, there's this conundrum, and it is complex, and it will take a long time to solve, if at all possible. But because it's so widespread, people seem to think they know a lot about this. And I just want to kind of break down the myths. What are some of the common misconceptions that we have societally about this disease?
Well, it isn't a condition which is easy to diagnose. It's been called by a good number of researchers a complex multiform syndrome. In other words, it's not like a bacterial infection where you know what the problem is. It clearly is to do with changes in the brain about which we have for years, since the time of Alzheimer himself, had ideas and hopes that we would be able to solve it by tackling the basic changes in the brain. But in fact, it's been, despite billions of dollars being spent on research for the development of drugs, we have got very little progress made to date.
No cure in sight.
There's certainly no cure. And a large number of the involved scientists would now argue that there will not be a cure, that there may well be a whole lot of little cures. It's possible that in fact we're dealing with something which is a conglomeration of states, and therefore in connection with drug development it may be necessary to develop several. On the other hand, what everybody does agree about is that what we're dealing with now is too little, too late. So by the time the classical neuropathology of plaques and tangles is present in the brain. People now, the scientists now argue, and the clinicians now argue, that even if we develop a drug, it is not going to reverse the condition once it's got that far. The damage is just far too great. And therefore, we have to come forward and start trying to tackle this before clinical signs are even manifest.
Intervene earlier.
Sorry?
Intervene earlier.
To intervene earlier at a preclinical time when people are still apparently perfectly healthy.
How do we do that?
No outward signs.
How do we do that?
Well, we do that by tackling the problem of trying to track biomarkers. And biomarkers are very early molecular changes in the body which are monitored to see if they're beginning to transform to produce the very, very first signs of the amyloid, the sticky plaques that eventually develop in the brain, to try and catch these before they do a great deal of damage and before they have started to affect the behavior of anybody. So people in their 50s or 60s would be people who would be targeted for this kind of research. It's all at the research stage, this development.
Given that we're seeing these, I don't know if the right word is markers, but markers on some people's brains earlier before we see the outward manifestations of this illness, we talked about the millions of bucks being spent on Alzheimer's, less than other diseases, but nonetheless money being spent. We're trying to find a cure. You say there is probably not one in sight ever, possibly. But usually when we're looking for a cure or even prevention or treatment, we need to find the cause. So if my brain has those markers on them, what causes me to have them and you not to have them?
I suspect I have them. I'm quite a bit older than you. We don't really know is the answer to that. The cause of Alzheimer's is not known. The assumption for many years was that the cause was essentially these amyloid plaques, which then later on are followed by tangles. In other words, neurodegeneration of a standard kind. But now there are arguments among the basic scientists as to whether the amyloid is actually cause or effect. And so some people are trying to go upstream and to think about inflammation caused by any number of things, to think perhaps about exposure to toxins, to think about other kinds of damage that may have happened to the brain. And one of the changes is that a large number of people now believe that what we're dealing with most of the time are so-called mixed dementias. In other words, there will have been cardiovascular changes and the vascular system in the brain will have had mini strokes or something like that together with the symptoms of the beginnings of the plaques forming. And perhaps it's quite likely, but we're not really sure, but the majority of so-called Alzheimer cases are quite likely to be actually mixed dementias.
And given that, a lot of diseases, again, things like cancer stuff, lifestyle influences, socioeconomic factors influence that. Is that the case in Alzheimer's too? Socioeconomic factors play a role? Does it discriminate?
Yes, there are strong arguments for this, and particularly for education. There is evidence, this is all epidemiological data looking at populations and comparing them, and there is evidence that people who have had less education are at higher risk for getting Alzheimer's than people who've had more extended education. Now, up to a point, I think this is a good argument, but I think it probably doesn't go far enough, because there are other things that people with less education are exposed to that middle classes and wealthy people are not exposed to. A much greater proportion would be living in toxic environments, and they would be exposed to environmental toxins more. They're possibly living in poor houses, particularly in America, where there's lead paint inside the house. And this will have affected the young children very badly, and it will have affected their neurodevelopment. And that plays out through the life course and makes people more vulnerable.
I want to go back to this idea of having plaques on your brain. Could someone have Alzheimer's disease, neuropathologically, is that the right word, but not demonstrate any symptoms as they get older?
Yes, well, as I mentioned earlier, it appears that that is the case, because now that we can see into the brains of living people and are doing research, neuroimaging research on Alzheimer's, the studies that have been done keep showing that approximately 30% of the people who they test, these are people who are in the control group because they haven't got Alzheimer's. They are not the subjects of the research, but this research, of course, always has control groups of so-called normal people.
Right.
And they find that up to 30% of them actually have plaques in their brains.
And many of them never go on to develop the disease.
Well, we don't know whether many or not, because this is a newish development, but it seems that they don't. Now, some researchers would argue right away, well, what that means is that they just die of something else, but they would have got Alzheimer's if heart disease hadn't got in the way. And others would say, well, if we all lived to be 130, we would all end up with Alzheimer's, which seems like a possibly reasonable way to think about it, but we'll never be able to prove that. So we're left with this conundrum of what it is that allows certain of us to remain apparently healthy and untroubled by dementia, even though one may well have the plaques. Now, I should go a little further and say that if it gets as far as the tangles building up, then things are very bad by that point. We're talking only about the deposition of plaques in the brain.
We spent the last 10 minutes or so talking about Alzheimer's, and you know, it's a word that's just in our everyday vocabulary. We all know it now.
That's
it
right.
wasn't always the way. It was and we're going to talk about who the disease is named after, but before it was classified as a disease, people who had symptoms, signs of dementia, what were they considered to be afflicted with? Because it wasn't Alzheimer's.
No, it was, and this is true around the world, it seems. I'm an anthropologist, and there hasn't been a huge amount of research globally, but it seems that this is the case everywhere, that people, until we named this condition as a medical condition, prior to that time, people generally thought of it as normal aging. That is to say that a good number of people in the population would start to lose their memory and go a little funny and so on. And
they'd say, oh, it's just because she's old.
It's just being old. Right. And in the language that was used in Europe, in various European languages, was that, and including English, was senile dementia, which is a term that, of course, we would like to dispose of entirely these days. But that was thought of as normal.
Okay, so enter a guy named Aloysius Alzheimer. Who was he?
Yes, so he was working at the very beginning of the 20th century in Germany, and he was working with a group of patients where he started to, one or two very patients who become famous after their death because he wrote very intense case studies about them. And he was one of the first people to be able to observe these people while they were getting really very ill in their hospital where they were hospitalized, and then afterwards took their brains and dissected the brains. And he was able to show with his colleagues the link, apparent link, between these neurodegenerative changes of the plaques and tangles with the clinical degeneration of these people. But what was very special about his cases were that they were of a special kind of dementia. They were all people who were considerably younger than the age when older people get Alzheimer's. These were people who were getting it in their 40s or 50s. And it turns out now, we all know well in retrospect, and Alzheimer himself probably suspected, that people from these families were carrying a special gene, And there are three genes that are now well known and well established. But it is a rare disease. But it occurs in clusters of families around the world. It's not just in Germany or in...
What we would now call early onset?
It's now called early onset Alzheimer's. And it is a brutal disease because it strikes very early and it progresses faster. And so it causes real devastation.
So he, observes this, reports this, writes about this. Is this how Alzheimer's kind of sort of it's named, but sort of enters the public consciousness of being, an epidemic? And I know you're not totally hopeful about that word, but if I can use it just for a moment, is that where it sort of people start saying, wow, this is the thing we're dealing with in society, we have to start understanding it?
Yes, I think so. But what is interesting when you look back to the history of Alzheimer's is that Alzheimer's himself did not believe he'd discovered a new disease, because he said, these people are much younger. I can't believe that this is senile dementia. But his superior, Émile Crépelin, who is a very, very famous psychiatrist, wanted this disease named to enhance his lab and the status of his group. And he was actually feeling somewhat in competition with Freud, and he wanted to really establish that what was going on was something very concrete in the brain. And so the name was given to it reluctantly by Alzheimer. Then what happened was that the experts tended to forget this disease or this condition for a long time, and it really only became solidified in the 1970s. And at that point, we were at the point where many more people were living to old age, and therefore it was hard to ignore this condition. And secondly, the specialty of geriatrics was coming to the fore. And there was a lot of pressure. By this time, there were advocacy groups and a lot of pressure from advocacy groups arguing that this should be fully recognized as a medical problem.
And nowadays, we have so many advocacy groups, numbers of them dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's. Generally, how would you characterize their approach to this illness?
Well, I think it varies a little bit from country to country, but of course, they're quite remarkable organizations because, for example, the American, the Canadian, the British groups all sponsor research as well as being concerned about the families that are affected. So they have these two goals in mind. One is to assist families where Alzheimer strikes and to give support initially for the affected person, but then also, of course, for the family members. But the other goal that they have, which has become larger and larger and more important, is to actually sponsor research by drawing in funds from various sources. And their research adds greatly to what we know about this condition, in addition to, obviously, to government-funded research.
Do you think that's the right approach, sort of two-pronged approach? This sort of two-pronged approach to advocacy?
Oh, I do indeed, but I wish it was really two-pronged, because what has happened again and again is that the research takes over and the care and the support gets a bit pushed into background. So all through the whole history of this, there has never been much money allotted to support.
What was the trigger? I mean, I imagine for a long time, scientists, researchers are trying to chase this cure. There is, I don't know, is there a consensus that, there is no cure? What's the trigger for people to start focusing on prevention rather than cure?
Well, what's happening in the scientific world is that they are trying to focus on prevention through the tracking of the biomarkers. And the hope there would be to develop a drug which they'll be able to use at a very, very early preclinical stage, when the person is still healthy, in effect, to administer a drug which will stop the progression of the buildup of the amyloid. That is the idea. That is called prevention. But of course, that's not conventionally what we think of by prevention. Conventionally, we think of more of a public health approach. And I believe very strongly that there's a lot of evidence that we should also tackle it in approaching it as a public health problem. First thing we have to learn is that Alzheimer's isn't simply a disease of old age. Not that it does strike some people younger, but what I mean by that is that the seeds of neurodevelopment are set down in utero and in infancy and in early child care throughout the educational system, also through the food we eat and the environments that we live in. And the build-up to getting possible dementia later in life one is at much greater risk if the whole of one's life course is in effect somewhat damaged for one reason or another. And so we need to get beyond this idea of thinking that it's just old people. It's an old person's problem, and there's a lot of them around, and they're a drain on the economy, and let's just sort of push it a bit to one side. We have to recognize that every one of us is potentially a victim of this situation.
I suppose, though, if we're going to do detection and prevention early, there also comes up a lot of ethical debate about this and what the implications might be.
Yes. The ethical part is the question of social inequalities in society. That obviously middle class and wealthy people have much better opportunities for looking after themselves, for eating good food, for avoiding polluted environments and so on. And sometimes we have better social supports, although that's not necessarily the case.
I want to bring up a graph. This is by Alzheimer's Disease International. This is about the global impact of dementia there. And you can see the numbers of millions of global impact going up, 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 up. If this disease is an epidemic or perhaps a pandemic, it's all over the world. It's not just in one or two countries or in the Western Hemisphere.
That would be a better word.
I mean, what approach, this is the big question, what approach should the health authorities be taking to tackle this pandemic?
Right. Well, first of all, I would like to say that those figures are highly suspect. They could be out in either direction.
Okay.
If you stop very briefly to think about the situation in many, many countries of the world, most of the African continent, a large part of the Indian, South Asian continent, parts of China and so on, the figures that are collected there for a condition like this are highly, highly questionable, because by far the majority of people who are affected never get to medical care and are never seen by a doctor. And when one thinks about this and even considers the United States, there was an official statement that was published in one of the journals relatively recently, a year or two ago, saying that they believe that in the United States, at least 50% of people with Alzheimer's never get to
50.
Yes.
Okay. Half the people.
Because of their healthcare system, right? And then you think, well, how do they get these numbers in that case? And how do you get numbers out of Africa? And nobody's tracking around in the villages, and you can't just walk up and see, oh, yes, that person's got Alzheimer's. So we have to question these numbers. They could be a lot. There could be many more. But on the other hand, it could be the other way.
I guess the question is that if national or international strategies are needed for this disease, it is going up by what numbers I accept that we don't know, but if we do need these national or international strategies, I mean, many diseases have been cured, wiped out, lessened, those things. Right. Why is this disease any different?
Because it's partly because it's associated with aging, and partly because what that means is that the proportion of older people in each population is these days greater and greater, because we have done great things to help people live longer, but now we're finding the other side of this story, that means we've also going to have a lot more people who are demented in old age unless we do something about this. And the fear is that it will actually affect economies in very negative ways. And that is what is going to drive some of the changes in connection with thinking about this condition.
Margaret Lock, thank you. Appreciate your time today.
You're welcome.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.